Hi, this is Cathy English, the curator of Revelstoke Museum and Archives. I have a book that I'd like to read to you. This is called The Whistling Mountain by Mary DAEM. Mary DAEM was a local author, and this book was published in 1960. Chapter 1 of The Whistling Mountain. David Dunn was tired of riding on the train. When he had left Vancouver the previous day, he had not thought that possible. He had never before ridden in a train. He had ridden in an elevator, he had ridden in a bus, and he had ridden in a taxi in the family car. But a train ride was a new experience, and he had been so excited he had thought the train would never start. Now he was beginning to wonder if it would ever stop. "Mother," he asked her the umpteenth time, "when do we get to Swiftwater?" "Soon." "But you said that when I asked you before." David slumped down in his seat and stared out of the window. There were so many trees out there, more than he'd ever thought there were in the whole world. They didn't grow in neatly tended boulevards as they had outside the apartment building where David had been brought up. These were wild trees, pine and poplar and cedar and fir, and they grew wherever they could let down their roots. They grew right beside the rushing train. They grew on the banks of the rivers and streams, and they grew high, high, high up the mountainsides. "Why, there are enough trees on that one mountain to make Christmas trees for every child in Vancouver, I bet," David marveled. He rubbed his eyes. They were getting tired from watching so many things gliding by. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, and when he opened them again, there was a waterfall, so close he could almost feel the wetness. But in a second it was gone, and a mountain stuck straight up before him. David's head began to ache. Inside him there was an ache too, but it was a vague, uneasy sort of an ache. It was the kind of ache you get when you've left old familiar things, the kind of ache you get when you are going to a new home, as David was, and you aren't quite sure you are going to like it. David was just a little bit homesick. All his life, David had lived in the middle of a big and sprawling city. His home had been an apartment building, and he was used to city noises and to crowded buildings, and to people by the hundreds all rushing here and there or standing in lines. It was only when he was taken to the city park that David had seen trees that grew by themselves and spaces with nobody in them. David's daddy had been brought up in the country, and he had tried to tell David how different life was, where there were not so many people. No matter how hard he tried, Mr. Dunn could never quite get used to living in an apartment or to living in a city. Finally, he and David's mother had decided that he need not do so. So he had studied hard and taken some examinations and changed his office job for that of a park warden and had been sent to Swiftwater, BC. David had continued to go to school in Vancouver until near the end of the term. Then his mother had packed some of their things and sold some of them and given up the apartment, and now she and David were on their way to their new home. "Mother," David asked, pushing back his fair hair with one hand and turning from the window, "did you ever see so many trees?" "No, I never did. Your daddy tried to tell me it would be like this, but so many miles without any houses at all, it just doesn't seem possible." David thought his mother sounded rather unhappy. "Tell me again what our home's going to be like." "Well, you remember how I read you Daddy's letter? There's a pretty log cabin away up on the side of a mountain. There's a stream that runs close to it, and there are trees everywhere you look. And you can see a big mountain from the front windows of the house. There are no electric lights, and there are no sidewalks. Is that why I couldn't bring my bike?" "Yes, that's why. Daddy said there'd be no use having it without anywhere to ride it. I'm glad you didn't make too much fuss about it." David hitched himself into a more comfortable position and thought about that. He had been given the bicycle only the year before when he was 8, and he was proud of it. He'd learned to ride it in a small park at the end of the block, and he'd only fallen once or twice. But it wasn't really much use. He couldn't ride it to school because of the traffic, and the park was so small that a fellow could just ride around and around in a circle. He guessed he wasn't going to miss that bike of his too much after all. But there were other things he was going to miss. Imagine having no electric lights, and no sidewalks, and no buses, and worst of all, no other boys to play with. He leaned down and retied the laces on his new brown shoes. He crossed one foot over the other. If there's nobody to play with, Mother, he said slowly, there won't be anyone to tease me about my whistling, will there? There are boys and girls right in Swiftwater, son, his mother explained, but Daddy says we are going to be living all of 3 miles from there. You'll get to know them when you go down to school at the end of the summer. And by the end of the summer, I just know you'll learn to whistle. You won't have to be quiet the way you were in the apartment. You can make all the noise you want. Why, when we get there, I'm going to yell and yell, David exclaimed, and I bet you I can whistle in no time. He pushed back his hair again and his blue eyes twinkled. When are we going to get there? Very soon now, in 15 minutes, in fact. David put his comic books into a neat pile and gathered up the peel of his orange and put it into a bag. His heart beat faster as he stared out of the window. There aren't any houses yet, Mother, he complained. There ought to be some by now, shouldn't there? The conductor walked along the aisle and stopped beside them. There aren't any houses here, son, he explained, sitting in friendly fashion on the arm of their seat. You see, you can't grow things in these mountains, and in winter the snow is very deep. The section men who look after the train tracks do live in little houses close to the track, but that's all you'll see until you reach Swiftwater, and there aren't more than a dozen houses there. That's where we're going, David volunteered. Dad's waiting for us. Oh, you'll be the new warden's wife, ma'am. You'll find Swiftwater very small compared to Vancouver, but the people are friendly. Better get ready now. We only stop for a minute. I'll take your luggage. He lifted the suitcases from the racks above and began to move down the aisle as the train slowed down. Swiftwater, Swiftwater, next stop. David was right at his heels, throwing an impatient glance at his mother as he urged her to hurry. As the train stopped, he jumped down to the cinder platform. Behind him, the conductor was helping his mother down the steps. Their luggage was piled beside the track. The train began to move. The conductor swung aboard, and while David was still staring right straight in front of him, the train was gone. There was a huge mountain right in front of David with snow on the very top, and the air was so clear and so cold. Almost before he realized what was happening, his father was there and had kissed his mother, and suddenly David was caught up in a man-sized squeeze. His father looked different, bigger and more handsome. His face was tanned, and he looked wonderful in his forest green uniform. His boots were shining, and his hat looked just like the hats the Mounties wear. David was very much impressed. His father stood back a bit and looked at him. How tall you've grown, son. An inch at least since I left you in Vancouver. My, am I ever glad to have my family here. It's been lonesome without you. He hugged them both once more and then turned towards the luggage. You'll have to help me take care of this, son. We'll take what we can carry and I'll get the rest later. Oh, by the way, David, have you learned to whistle yet? He teased. David picked up the biggest suitcase and tried to carry it. He put it down with a thud. His face was red and his hair flopped into his eyes. I can't whistle yet, he answered his father, but I'm going to learn. That's the spirit. We've got more whistlers in these mountains, David. Wait until you hear the marmots. They're whistling for you. But before David could ask what marmots were, his father had loaded himself with luggage and was swinging along the edge of the track ahead of him and depositing the heavier luggage inside the little log station. It's the end of chapter 1.